Hi everyone, this is Heather Box from the Million Person Project, and the Million Person Project is a global project about love, storytelling, and connecting changemakers. And I'm so excited to be here today with Aspen Baker, who is an award-winning author and the founder and executive director of Exhale. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the viewers and tell them a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Heather. I'm really excited for this conversation because I don't often get the chance to kind of talk about what it's like to tell my story, and it's not always simple or easy, so it's a great opportunity for me. So my story is about an abortion that I had when I was 24 years old, and it's been a long time since then. I just turned 40. I've been telling this story of having my abortion right out of college and looking for support and not finding it, and then I created something. I created something called Exhale with other women because we wanted to make sure that people who'd had abortions could be listened to and heard and have their stories be heard. And we did it outside of the political context, and that was a very unusual thing to do at the time. It was a very controversial thing to do at the time. It was controversial to tell my story because it wasn't fitting really nicely into like a pro-choice or a pro-life box. And so it's been 15 years since that happened, and a lot has changed. Our organization is a national organization. We run a talk line. It's available in multiple languages. Places like Planned Parenthood refer to our service. And we've been working with other people who are telling their stories around their abortion privately and publicly for a long time. And in the last couple of years, I've gotten the chance to write a book about our work. And then I got the opportunity to do a TED Talk last year. And now I'm in the process of trying to tell a new kind of story that's about me and what's next, and also because the world we're operating in has changed quite a lot too. And so it's another creative place to be in.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining this conversation. You're a perfect person to be talking about the power of personal stories with. So I'm excited to dive right in. Here's the deal, is that you have told your story in some really major ways.
Yep.
An award-winning book, a TED Talk that has 1.5 million views. So you told your story, the world has received it.
Yes.
And when people look at you and they think about sharing their own story, they're like, yeah, but that's Aspen Baker. She's gone viral on the internet. That's not me. What about the first time you shared your story? What was it like before the world was receiving it and you were quietly with your own story, not telling anyone, and then you decided to tell your story? When was that, and how was that for you?
I started to tell my story even when I was pregnant, before I had the abortion. And when I was pregnant, I told my mom and I told my dad that I was pregnant and I was probably going to have an abortion. And I had been raised pro-life and I had been raised Christian. I was not sure how that was going to go. And then I told a friend of mine who I was working with at a local bar. You know, we were working together, we were closing up the bar, she was about ready to pour me, my shot of vodka or tequila or whatever it was, and I was like, no, I'm not going to have that. And she was like, what, are you pregnant? And I was like, yeah. And then she told me about her abortion, and that was the first time someone had ever told me that they had had an abortion. That changed a lot of things for me, because I remember thinking, Polly's cool. I like Polly. She's had an abortion and she seems okay. So maybe if I did that, I would be okay too. I did start telling people, and I don't know that I would say it was a story yet. It was more of the fact, like I had an abortion or I'm pregnant. And then at some point when I knew I was starting the organization and we were going to be running this talk line and nothing like that had ever been done before, I knew that my personal story was going to be really key to explaining why this was needed. That I couldn't just be like, I'm an activist and I've heard from some other people that this would be useful, or I read some books and I took some classes and I discovered that there is this unmet need and it's a public health thing and I'm going to meet it. That it was incredibly personal. And I knew that was important to tell as a way to bring people into understanding what this need was. And the need that we identified was for emotional support, for people to be able to tell their story, to be heard, and to have that happen in a non-judgmental way with people that cared about them, and that we were going to do that through a talk line. And so I made that decision pretty early on, and then I was negotiating sort of what part of my story I was going to tell, what parts of it felt comfortable to be known publicly, and which parts I was going to keep to myself. So there was a desire to tell a true story and one that was real for me, but it couldn't be everything. It couldn't be, every, last sort of intimate personal part of me. Because recently, I was talking to someone and I mentioned something that had happened during that time after I'd had the abortion. She's like, I didn't know that. And I was like, well, yeah, there's like 50 things that are not known,
right.
That are not the story that I've told in a public way, because there's a lot of other people involved. There's the guy involved. There's my family. There's relationships that are at stake in that. And then there's just things that felt important for me, and knowing that those things might change over time. So, and this was also basically pre-internet.
Right.
This, like, there was some email, there wasn't internet, but there wasn't social media. There wasn't, things weren't getting shared and spread in the way that they are now. And I often wonder if all of those things happened to me now, and I was 24 years old now, and had my abortion experience, and social media was available, like, that there would be other choices that I would make, or other choices that would be available to me for what kind of thing I would want to do to meet this need.
In the hotline, it's people who have had abortions or people who are navigating that choice.
Our niche is really for people who've already had an abortion.
Okay.
So we're not kind of working with people through their decision-making process. We're helping them after the fact.
And what do you think the power of telling your story is?
The power of telling your story is a lot of things. I mean, it can be personal. It can be personally powerful. It can be really healing. It can be really scary. It can be really vulnerable. It can be really empowering. It can be confidence boosting. I mean, there's a whole range of things that it can feel for an individual. I'm thinking of one caller, who hadn't told anyone about her abortion for, 30 years, and then called our talk line, and then wrote us back to let us know that she works on telling her story, like, one person at a time. And every time she tells her story, it's, with less tears. And then we know, that there are people like Emily Letts, who worked at an abortion clinic and who was getting an abortion and decided to film it and to share it with the world, because she knew that people walking into the clinic were afraid because of the unknown, and she wanted to show them what it was really like. So boom, before she even has her abortion, she's ready to, like, share that in a personal way. And that public storytelling was a lot about for other people. And that's one of the things we've heard about a lot when women are deciding to not keep it to themselves and to do it in a more public way, that it's often because they don't want other people to feel alone. They don't want other people to feel isolated. They don't want other people to be afraid of the unknown. So there's a very altruistic kind of thing that I think happens. And I have certainly heard that, and we kind of talk about a story begets a story begets a story. And so that idea of one person telling kind of leads to another person telling. And for an issue like abortion that is at the center of controversy and that is stigmatized, it's incredibly important for individual well-being, but also for cultural well-being, that there is this transformation that needs to take place in a cultural way from this thing that has been kept silent and marginalized to something that gets to be talked about. It gets to still be emotional, it gets to still be meaningful and important and powerful, but it gets to get talked about.
One of the things that I love that you say and the terms that you use at Exhale is this idea of pro-voice. So can you share with us a little bit about what that means?
When we started Exhale, me and my co-founders, we just wanted to create a place where people could be heard and they could tell their stories. And we knew that pro-life people had abortions, and we knew that pro-choice people had abortions, and we knew that people who identified as neither or identified as both had abortions. And we wanted to be available to everybody. And we didn't want people to feel like that they would have to pick a side, or, would a pro-life or person feel comfortable calling an organization that was pro-choice, or, vice versa. And in the end, we thought these are all people that have something in common, which is their shared abortion experience. And yet they're very unique and diverse, that they have all these political beliefs and different backgrounds and religious beliefs. And then over time, we realized that what we were hearing on the line was rarely heard in public. That the kind of stories that we were hearing were not what was getting talked about on CNN or Fox News, or even the way that individual people might talk to each other about what an abortion was. And so we thought that these stories could really disrupt the status quo of the conflict, and that they could really help sort of usher in a new kind of conversation. And so we started thinking about how, our work wasn't about an absence of, or a mushy middle, or like a nonpartisanness, that there was a real stand that we were taking that was proactive and was about creating a different kind of conversation, a different kind of cultural climate, and a different kind of experience for people who'd had abortions. And so that's what we named Pro-Voice. And Pro-Voice is not a position, it's not a policy position, like we're for or against, one law or the other. It's a way of being in the world, and we focus on listening, non-judgmental listening, and ethical storytelling, and like you. And that those two things are in relationship with one another. You're listening to me right now, I'm telling my story right now, but we could switch, we would switch it, and I could be the listener, and you could tell me the story. That this is how we are creating a connection, and this is how we can open a conversation. And those are the things that Pro-Voice is about, is opening a conversation that is very hard to start on abortion, but other conflicted issues as well.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that idea of very intentional listening. And one thing that I've heard you talk about also is about how to mirror language that the storyteller is using. Yeah. Can you explain that a little bit to the viewers?
Yeah, so on issues like abortion or other, conflicted hot political issues, there's a lot of lingo. There's a lot of words to sort of signal, which side are you on? And we found, that if a woman was calling and she'd had an abortion and she was talking about her baby, we trained our counselors to also talk about her baby. We weren't going to reframe that language and say, oh, you mean the fetus. Let me tell you some medical, information so that it's not really a baby, or sort of vice versa. That what that did was tell her that she didn't know her own experience. And I have had that, from the beginning. Let me tell you what your feelings are, or let me tell you why you're having those feelings, instead of just allowing them to exist. And so one of the reflective language, especially on abortion, where words carry a lot of weight and heat, to allow a woman to speak for herself, to hear the words that she is using, to ask why those words are important for her and what they mean to her, and reflecting that back is conveying that we're paying attention, and it conveys that we care. And that is something that we can all do, that you don't just have to be a counselor on a talk line to do it, that is a pro-voice practice that we can learn how to do.
In the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively easy thing to change, and it has such a huge impact on our ability to see one another and to feel seen by each other. Yeah. And one of the things that I love that you talk about is pro-voice is not just for people who have had abortions. Yeah. You're also encouraging people, that have experienced incarceration, abuse, neglect, other very, subjects that tend to be stigmatized, to speak up and to share their experience, and for the people who are listening to them to receive them. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connection between these subjects that are so highly stigmatized in our society.
Yeah, well, pro-voice was definitely created in the realm of abortion and for the political context of abortion, and it is drawn from lots of other practices, from non-defensive, nonviolent communication, and these ideas of listening and storytelling as a means to a conversation, especially ones that are hard to talk about, is agnostic. And as we have traveled out in the world, talking about abortion, we have encountered lots of people with hard to talk about experiences, stigmatized experiences, taboo experiences, who are saying like, I don't have an abortion experience, but I have this. And this would, be really helpful. What I'm interested in right now is really this like tension between the individual's well-being and cultural well-being. That it can be really difficult to tell a personal story in a public way. It is still difficult for me in lots of ways, and is my well-being more important than the community's well-being? Our culture at large needs to change around abortion. It's harmful, it's hurtful, it's divisive, it's polarizing, it's hostile, it's violent. That needs to change. So how do we kind of hold both of these things together?
The first step of storytelling is to really tell your story to get in integrity with yourself, with all of who you are, with what you've experienced. That first step of telling your story for you, to me, is so important. And then the next step is, maybe telling people in your community, telling people that you may, influence on a certain issue. But to me, the critical first step is first telling it for you. And I love that way, though, in which you sort of showed how some people do those first couple steps, the story for them, the story for people who have related to them, and that's it. And that's where it goes for them. And other people go out and do giant TED Talks in front of thousands of people that then goes out to millions of people. Yeah. And that they're both great. Yeah. That it's about you and your own comfort with what it is that you want to do with your story. Your story is yours. And the decision to share it is yours. And I think that that's a really important thing for our viewers to really reflect on.
All of these people have heard, this like part of my story. It was 15 years of getting to TED stage and having a book, and that I didn't do it alone. And we're sitting in front of a poster of like lots of exhale people, that there is an organization, there is a community. And that is probably the most critical thing that I've learned, is really having people to rely on and who understand what it takes for me to tell my story, and that even if I can make it look good, like my TED Talk was like 20 drafts. Like I worked on it a lot. It was hard work. I approached it like work. I practiced it in front of different people. There was a real work and structure and people in place to help me do that. And that we also knew that because my talk was controversial, that it was happening, that it hadn't happened before, all this kind of stuff, that there was also a lot of press built in around the talk, so when the talk came out, that it was welcomed into the world, and so there's a lot of strategy also, and a lot of organization and a lot of people involved behind the scenes. It's not just me thinking about it and like doing it on a whim.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we, and I in particular, try to help other people do who are thinking about telling their story around abortion, and who maybe are in a position and a job that's where it could risk their job and it can risk their family, and so that's real.
Yeah, I think that's so important for people to hear how much negotiation and strategy and practice and hours goes into someone getting up and telling their story as powerfully as you did on that TED stage. It doesn't just happen overnight for everybody. For some people it does.
For some people it does.
And for others it doesn't. And it's important to give yourself the container to feel very comfortable and confident when you do decide to share your story, and to have that support system.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining this conversation on the power of personal stories. And thank you for all the work that you do in the world and for being you. What is your advice for someone right now that's sitting on the edge of their seat thinking, I think maybe I need to tell my personal story?
2 probably really important things that I want them to know and I want them to hear. And the first is that they're enough. You know, who they are, what their experience was, their story is, it's enough. It doesn't have to be more. It doesn't have to be more simple or more complex or anybody else's story. It just has to be their own. So they're enough. And that's enough for the other person that needs to hear it. And because when I feel full of doubt or vulnerability, I just think that there's someone on the other side of this camera or on the other side who's just like waiting to hear that they're enough too. And then that's the way that they're gonna figure out how to tell their story. So the person who wants to tell is enough, and if they do it, they might face some difficult consequences. It might be hard. It might not feel like they get satisfaction right away, but know that there are people that are out there on the other side that are listening and that need to hear that story really badly.
Thank you, viewers, for tuning in, and thank you, Aspen, for joining this conversation. And I'm excited to share the link to your award-winning book with our viewers so that they can read it. And anything that you would like to share with them about how they can stay up with what you're doing, please do.
Great. Well, thank you. Yes, I would. I'd love you to read the book, and you can go to aspenbaker.com. That's my website, and keep track of the latest interviews or radio interviews or different speaking engagements that I have, and follow me on Twitter. Thank you very much for having me. It was really fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of you for tuning in, and I hope that you share your story. Bye.